as well. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of asking questions. Ms. Schlitz, you recently submitted a report, the EAC OIG semi-annual report to Congress, and I want to discuss some of the key findings in there. But at the time of the report was submitted, your office, you said, processed, I think you said 175, I had 174 in my notes, unique complaints so far this fiscal year. That's already an increase over last fiscal year in 2022, which I believe had about 271 complaints that came through. Are there any common themes that you're seeing inside the complaints of the last 2 years or so?
The complaints really do vary. What we do see is an uptick when states are having an election. We'll see more things come in. Quite a few of our complaints are related to the administration election, so we're referring states to the right official within that state to get closure on whatever the allegation may be. I can't say that we've seen specific trends, but I do have a breakdown in the more.
So let me dive in maybe then specifically. So if nothing jumps out to you, is we think about this, last year Georgia passed a voter integrity bill, made a lot of noise, right? A lot of news came out of this. The President of the United States called it Jim Crow 2.0. Major League Baseball took the All-Star game and moved it out of Atlanta. Really draconian and over-the-top rhetoric from my colleagues on the left. Did you see a huge uptick in calls from the state of Georgia following the passage of this law?
No, I can say that for the fiscal 2023 numbers, what we have seen, we had 374 unique complaints, and only 5 of those involved Georgia. They all were around the general election and the Senate runoff.
So less than 2% fiscal year for folks that maybe aren't always aware of fiscal years versus annual years. You guys run on a fiscal year because Congress runs on a fiscal year, but that includes the election. The election of last year in 2022, after, quote, Jim Crow 2.0, voter integrity laws are passed in Georgia, less than 2% of your calls came from the state of Georgia. Is that accurate?
I can say only 5 involved it. Oftentimes,
5 out of 375, so less than 2%. The reason I say 2% is because it was randomly averaged over 50 states, and Georgia's bigger than average, so it should show up at an even larger percentage if we assume it's based on population. What we're seeing is no real uptick at all. Why? Because people actually like the voter integrity law that was passed in Georgia. The evidence not only shows up that people aren't calling in because they don't have complaints, it also shows up because people were happy. If you look at the polling data on how people felt about the process of voting in Georgia, but also voter turnout increased in the state of Georgia and across all key demographic groups. Let me shift gears if I can. Again, your office recently completed the audit of HAVA funds, in particular as it relates to the CARES Act, awarded to California. How much money was awarded to California?
They had a total for all of the HAVA funds of $216.3 million.
$216.3 million total funds awarded to California. And was the main group, what was the main group that was awarded to in California was what firm?
That's the total pot of money of election security funds, 251 funds, the 101 HAVA funds, and then also CARES funds.
And then the CARES funds.
Okay, if you're speaking about the CARES funds, let me get you the exact number. And I believe you're referring to the SKDK contract, how much was awarded there?
Yes.
Yeah. So what we found is that 11.8 million in EAC HAVA funds were used for that contract. 9.9 million of those were CARES Act funds.
And does it concern you that this entity, through an expedited grant process, has ties to the Biden campaign?
We issued a December advisory that outlined some of the risks that we see with there being no mention in HAVA about restrictions around voter education campaigns. We think it's just an area of risk in general.
So would you recommend that policymakers put in place parameters to make sure that these types of grants aren't going to entities with clear political ideological leanings?
It is always, more helpful for us to have strong criteria to audit against. Without that, we are reliant on kind of the EEC and what their guidance is on each individual case-by-case basis on a state. That's what we point out in the advisory, that just raises increased risk, that you're not providing the same guidance to each state without
And
that.
I appreciate that. I think you pointed out a huge risk, and I think it's incumbent upon EAC and policymakers to put forward the guardrails that are needed to make sure that grant funding doesn't go to entities where you can simply go look on their website and claiming that they're part of a presidential campaign. I think that is an affront. People, if you told somebody in Wisconsin we spent millions of dollars and gave it to an entity that was part of Team Biden or Team anybody, I think they'd look at you and think you're nuts. That's what happened. I think we got to put the guardrails in place, and I appreciate your review and examination. I now recognize Mr. Carey for 5